We'll see. Monica is the plant materials specialist for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And in that role, she tests plant materials and planting technologies for conservation uses. So this made sense for Monica to talk about this topic. Monica has a very broad experience in ecological restoration, invasive plant management, land management, and wildlife habitat analysis. And one thing I've always appreciated about Monica's professional experience is that she has worked in the research arena, she has worked in the restoration practitioner arena, and she's also worked in kind of the education and service-based aspects of invasive plant management and ecological restoration. So we're really happy to have her here with us today and share her broad knowledge base about revegetation. So with that, Monica, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Can you hear me okay and see the screen okay?
Yes, we can. Everything looks good.
I lost the screen that gives me control of video and chat. So just let me know if you're seeing any questions come up through the way. So we'll get started. So today we want to talk about revegetation as part of weed management and gives you some tips for success. And I want to start out by just some basic definitions. So what do we mean by revegetation? And what we're talking about is to produce new growth of vegetation. It might be the natural process of having some vegetation recolonize the site, or we might want to deliberately introduce plants through revegetation. And also it's a way to start repairing damage that's done to a site, maybe through weeds or wildfire or flooding or other causes. And where I really see revegetation fitting into a weed management practice is in a prevention setting. So making sure that you have desired plants on the site so that you're preventing weeds from being introduced onto the site. And then also as part of your management process to have competitive species that are in the site. And you know, why would we want to include revegetation in weed management? And I think we've done a really great job in our campaign against the war on weeds, and people are really focused on getting rid of weeds out of their landscape. But I think sometimes we miss the whole picture. That it's not just about getting rid of what we don't want, and we really should be focusing a lot more on what plants we want in our plant community, what we want that landscape to look like as part of our weed control efforts. A lot of times when we're controlling weeds, we get into this cycle where we're treating the weeds, we end up opening space on the ground, open niches, and then the weeds reestablish and we end up in this cycle. But hopefully with revegetation, we can fill that space with a desired species, and we can break that weed cycle. This is a project, Jane gave me photos of this. It's 15 years after revegetation of a weedy site in Western Montana. It was treated once with a herbicide, and then plots were put in where it was either seeded or not seeded. We'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation, but again, it's focusing on, we might not be getting rid of the weeds completely, but we're addressing more what we want in the plant community. So the first thing we really need to do when we're getting started with revegetation as part of weed management is ask ourselves, do we actually need to revegetate this site? And generally, as a rule of thumb in Montana, if we have about 20 to 30% canopy cover of desired vegetation already on the site, then we think the site can naturally recover and we don't need to go through the whole revegetation process. And by canopy cover, I mean the vertical projection of a plant on the ground. And 20 to 30% might seem low, but if you think about some of our plant communities that we have, there's a lot of open space. We have a lot of bunch grasses, and so we're really looking at that 20 to 30% as a starting point, and that it could expand on the site. But a lot of our plant communities naturally have only like 50 or 60% canopy cover. Revegetation, when you incorporate it into an invasive plant management system, I really encourage you to think about it as a process and steps in that process and work through them all, because they're going to build on each other, and you're going to want to build on the success of one step to the other. So we're going to talk through these steps today, and also just be aware that monitoring is your feedback loop really for the adaptive management part of any system. I also want to mention, some of you may be familiar with this revegetation guidelines for Western Montana, and we're working on updating this. And in this guide, there were previously 14 steps to the revegetation process. So we're hoping to really simplify this into 7 main steps. And if you're familiar with the presentation or this document, as I'm going through the presentation, think about what was useful in that, or what was confusing, items that we could address and improve on as we're revising it. So the first step in any revegetation process is to do a site assessment or inventory. And this is really important because you need to make sure that the plants you select to revegetate are going to be adapted to the site. And there's going to be a few things that you want to look for. First of all, you're looking at the climate of the site. So you're paying attention to what is the growing season, what are the high and low temps, what annual precipitation do you get, and just as important is when are you getting that precipitation, because plants are adapted to different conditions. Landscape position is also really important. You want to know what elevation your planting is going to be on. Also the slope, because you can have differences in plants communities from one slope to the next or one aspect to the next. And also the hydrology of your site. If you're down in the lowlands, you need to pick plants that might be suitable to maybe some inundation or spring flooding. Knowing the soil is also just critically important, because you want to pick plants that are adapted to the soil, soil depth, soil texture, the water holding capacity, and also if you have any sort of salts present in your soils, you need to have adapted plants. Doing an inventory of the vegetation that's on the site is really important. So your current vegetation would include what do you have for desired plants and what do you have for weedy plants. And at this site, this step, I also like to think about what equipment do I have available, because that's really going to help dictate how I'm going to get the site revegetated. The next step in our process is to set objectives. Now that you have done an inventory, you can know what your site's going to be capable of. So you can pick objectives that are going to be attainable. And I say this because sometimes people move to the state and they might want to have a bunch of horses on their property and they want to seed in a bunch of pasture grasses. And there's a lot of sites that we have that just won't really, where those plants that they think they're going to have on their property are not going to thrive. So you need to know what your site is capable of growing. And then when you set your objectives, think about what your desired conditions are on the site. Do you want to produce forage, wildlife habitat? Are you trying to control erosion? Definitely we want to continue to prevent weed spread and compete against weeds. So you might have one or many different objectives for your site. And again, I want to get back to this point of just really emphasizing it's not just getting rid of our weeds. Our objectives are focusing on what do we want for our desired species. And I say that because in this picture here, it's a cheatgrass field with some rush skeleton weed in it. And we definitely want to control the rush skeleton weed. We don't want that spreading, but I would ask, what would be the value of this rangeland if you do control the rush skeleton weed? Having a cheatgrass field is probably not your landowner's objective. So what is the desired community in this case, and how do we get there? And this is another example where we controlled white top in a field, and we ended up with a lot of bare ground. We had great control, but again, we want to focus on what do we want on that site, because what we ended up with after a few years was just a lot of annual weeds. You've probably heard this term before, but when you're setting objectives, make sure they're specific but practical. They need to be measurable. This allows you to determine through monitoring if you're making progress. They need to be attainable, especially given the site potential and the climate. They need to be reasonable. So that might be your socioeconomic constraints, like the cost, which is a really real factor, and be able to accomplish it within a certain time frame. So we use this SMART acronym when we talk about objectives. So the next step in our revegetation process is to plan our weed control. And you'll notice that I'm saying plan weed control. And again, this is because all the steps need to build on each other. But some of the most common ways we use to control weeds in our plan would be herbicides. We might use repeated mowing or grazing. This could be to control the site, but you'll see that it's also really important for prepping the site for seeding. And then also biocontrol and cover crops are being used more and more to manage weeds before revegetating. But by far, I would say the most commonly used technique is to use a herbicide in your practice before revegetating. And some of the important things we need to know when using a herbicide is, are we going to use a selective herbicide or a non-selective herbicide? So a non-selective herbicide would be something that kills or stresses any of the plants that are on the site. So some examples of that might be Roundup or Journey. And then the selective herbicides are ones that will affect some of the plants, but not all of them. The tolerance is really going to vary from species to species. And some common herbicides you might be using are 2,4-D, Tordon, Milestone. But one thing that's really important is to understand how the selectivity is going to affect your site preparation for your seeding. And that's where being really familiar with your herbicide label and the precautions on it are going to be really important for seeding. You might be seeding using herbicides after you've seeded, and I've just pulled some text out of a Tordon label. I'm not saying use this or anything, but I'm just trying to key you into some of the wording that you're going to find in there. So a lot of labels are going to give you a time frame of when you can spray, usually 45 to 60 days after planting, or they might give you an indication of how big your plants should be before you can spray them without any injury. If you're using herbicides before seeding, you also need to use the precautions on the label. So for example, this label is suggesting that you might apply the herbicide in the fall and the grasses be planted in the winter or the spring. So that would be a winter dormant planting or the next spring. And then some labels are going to be real specific to the plants that they're going to be selective for. So they're going to list certain perennial grasses, and they also might provide a list of the species to really be careful of that you might cause injury to if you use it in conjunction with revegetation. So I really can't overemphasize enough how important it is to check the label before you do any revegetation. You only really need to make this mistake once to realize that you can very easily ruin a planting and spend hundreds of dollars on seed that's just not going to come up. And also really pay attention to this in the steps, because what you're going to do for weed control is really going to inform what you can seed and when you can seed it. So some common practices that we use for herbicides and revegetation programs are we would use a pre-plant application of glyphosate. So that's really common. We might use it a couple applications of glyphosate too. So really try to get the weeds out of the ground, spray the actively growing vegetation, allow them to regerminate, and then treat them again before you do put your seed into the ground. We also use broadleaf herbicides after grass seedings. And if you're going to use a broadleaf herbicide, make sure you're not incorporating forbs into that seeding. We've seen that mistake a lot as well. Sometimes we're spraying in the fall and then seeding in the spring. And this allows some of your herbicides to break down in the soil and give you the time lag that you need before you revegetate. But make sure whatever species you're seeding, that they're matched to the herbicide that you're using, the selectivity and the timing. Okay,
Monica,
yeah.
can I interrupt a second? Did you want to share one of your polls, the first one about revegetation?
Sure. And this is a good time too. We're about halfway through the PowerPoint. So if you want to enter your name and license number in the chat.
And then I'll pull up the poll. We're going to see how well people can multitask. Let's see. I'm having a little difficulty because there's a bunch of chats popping up where I want to hit the open poll. So we'll give it a minute here. Yes, I'm having trouble multitasking. Here we go. Let's open this poll.
Okay, what do we get for some responses?
I'll go ahead and close it and then show the results. Oh, a few people are still replying, Monica. Okay, can you see the results?
Yeah, that's excellent. Here I can, if people can't see this, I can move it onto the screen, but it looks like the majority of people have used revegetation as part of your weed management. So that's really encouraging. And it's a good timing for this because we're just going to get into looking at the steps for making a seeding plan and some really important things to consider. We're going to talk about how to select seed mix and the seeding rate, including what species to seed. And we're going to look at what seeding equipment we might use or seeding method, and also the timing that we're going to apply our seed to the ground. So we'll look at all of these in more depth. Okay, so designing a seed mix can be, there's a lot of different things to think about as you're thinking about this. And first, I would say, whatever you pick as species, they need to meet your landowner goals and objectives and the site goals. And they need to address, what the site assessment was and what the site is going to be capable of. So that's one of the first things to think about. A lot of people want to know, well, how diverse should I make my seed mix? And just a rule of thumb would be about 5 to 10 species. So with at least five species, you're getting a little bit of diversity, but you don't really want to have more than 10 species, because what we've been finding in research and monitoring is that when you add more than 10 species, you're really only getting a smaller proportion of those that are establishing. So I'll see seed mixes with 20 species, and we really are seeing between 5 and 9 species established. So we kind of aim between 5 to 10 species. Once you get over 10 species, you start seeing competition between the species that you're seeding. Really important, if we're going to be controlling weeds into the future with a broadleaf herbicide, don't include forbs in your seed mix. I've seen this happen, and literally the few forbs that remain on the site probably cost hundreds of dollars in seed to have them on the site. And then there's just a lot of diversity that we try to mix into the seed mix. So you want to have species that grow at slightly different seasons. You want to have a mix of different growth forms like bunch grasses or sod forming grasses, maybe some shallow rooted grass or deeper rooted species, and then also the short and long lived perennials. And some of that diversity helps utilize resources more completely over time and space, and it helps them be more competitive with the weeds, so you leave less resources available for the weed species. When you're seeding into a site that's going to have weed competition, it's really important to also pick fast establishing species. So short-lived perennials are fast establishing. Some of the annual species, if you want to include an annual in there. Also, some of our introduced species are really fast establishing, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. But I also want to bring up that I would avoid pre-made mixes from unknown sources or far away sources, because a lot of times you'll have species in those that just aren't really suitable for your site. And that's where we also see different weed species showing up in seed mixes. So one consideration to have when you put together a seed mix is if you should include native species or introduced species or both. And there's pros and cons to both of them. So I just want to talk about these and compare them a little bit. So first of all, a native species is something that evolved over hundreds or thousands of years in a geographic location and a plant community. And we're looking at species that are not only native to North America, but that are also native to Montana and adapted to Montana. Where an introduced species has been intentionally introduced by humans and brought to our landscape and our region intentionally because it has qualities of a plant that we might want to plant. So it might be competitive, it might be good forage, it might provide good erosion control, and generally they're from the same region, the latitude of the Northern Hemisphere, so they're well adapted to our environment. Native species function well as part of the native plant community because they've evolved together, where some of our introduced plant species have a tendency to form monocultures or limit diversity. And they can also inhibit the establishment of some of our native plants. This is just a generalization, but many of our native species just don't compete as well as with the introduced weeds as the introduced species that we're seeding. The introduced species can be more competitive And a lot of that is because they establish really easily and they grow faster and establish faster than some of our natives. And again, this is just a real generalization because we do have some native species like cultivars of blue bunch wheatgrass that establish well and do well with weeds, our invasive weeds. Another concern with the introduced species is that they might spread off-site from where you've seeded them. Okay, so one thing that's really important when you're selecting a species to seed and you're going to buy seed is to make sure that you're buying a proven selection or a cultivar that we know does well in Montana. And one way to get information on this is to go to our plant material tech notes. We have a tech note on the different seeding rates for species that we recommend in Montana. And you're going to see tables in there with our native grasses and introduced species that we recommend. And it's going to have a seeding rate that we recommend, but then also these proven selections. So when you buy a species, you would be buying like Opportunity Nevada Bluegrass or Sherman Big Bluegrass. You would specify which cultivar you want to use. Okay, there's a lot of different species that you can choose from, but I wanted to highlight a few species that we know do well in Montana. They establish well, they establish quickly on sites that might be weed infested and you'd be incorporating this revegetation into weed management. One is blue bunch wheatgrass. We have a couple cultivars, the Goldar and the Anatone, that establish really well and produce a lot of above ground biomass and can be pretty competitive. Slender wheatgrass is a native plant that establishes quickly on a site. It's a short-lived perennial, so it only lives on a site maybe 3 to 5 years, and it might reseed itself a little bit, but it's designed to establish quickly and be competitive and hold the site while other slower species establish. And because it is a real fast establishing species, I just put on here that we really only recommend seeding it at about 5 or 10% of your seed mix. Some other native species that we see doing well and competing well with weeds are Snake River wheatgrass, Western wheatgrass, and thick spike wheatgrass. Some of our introduced wheatgrasses that are quite competitive and establish well throughout Montana are tall wheatgrass and intermediate or pubescent wheatgrass. And I would say that all of these would do well throughout most places in Montana. Basin wild rye and big bluegrass would also be competitive grasses, but probably more limited in the environments that they're going to grow in. I wanted to include on this list also sheep fescue and hard fescue. They're introduced grasses, they're slow to establish, but I just want to emphasize that they're incredibly competitive species, especially against weeds and annual weeds. They can be used in different mixes, but also to use caution that they could also form a monoculture. So you want to make sure you have good diversity in your seed mix. And then for Eastern Montana, some of the warm season grasses that we've seen be fairly competitive in weedy situations are prairie sandreed, little blue stem, and switchgrass. And these are warm season grasses that would do well in the eastern part of the state. And again, this is where I'm looking for some feedback from folks as we're working on the revegetation guidelines for Montana, and we're hoping to extend those for all of Montana, not just Western Montana. So if there's information that you're looking for with the grass species, if it's easier to have some suggested mixes that we could put together, we could develop several of those for around the state. But if you have comments or you've worked with this publication in the past and want to see certain information, please reach out to myself or Jane or Noel or the Missoula County Weed District, and hopefully we can get that incorporated into the next version. Okay, let's talk about seeding rate. What we recommend for a seeding rate is 20 to 25 seeds per square foot. And you'll notice that I didn't say a certain amount of pounds per acre. And that's because we adjust seeding rate based on seed size. And I'll talk about that in just probably the next slide. We also adjust the seeding rate for the seeding method. So this is the seed rate, 20 to 25 seeds per square foot if we're using a drill seeder. When we broadcast seed, we double that rate. When we're working in a weedy situation, so we have a lot of competition, I would also suggest doubling that rate. And whenever you're ordering seed or you're putting together a seed mix, it's really important to buy your seed and specify that you want the seed to be in pure live seed, so PLS. It is the seed industry way of describing the percent of seed, the percentage of that quantity of seed that's going to germinate. So PLS, pure live seed, is the percent pure seed times the percent that's going to germinate. So what that means is when you buy seed from a vendor, there's usually a little bit of inert material. There might be some, parts of your plant or just dead material in there, stuff that's not alive. It's the inert material, maybe also some of the weed contaminants that might be in there, but that's your percent purity. And then the percent germination is that you might have seeds in your mix, but not 100% of them are going to be alive. So it's going to be the percent of seeds that are going to be viable and be able to germinate. So just be aware of that term. And when you order seed, make sure you're ordering in pure live seed. Okay, getting back to the seed size and seed rate. So generally, the smaller the seed, we increase the seed rate just slightly. So the medium seed, the standard seed rate is 20 to 25 seeds per square foot. When we have a smaller size seed, we seed at about 30 to 50 seeds per square foot. And that's important because a lot of our smaller seeds, they need to be seeded near the surface of the soil. A lot of times they get planted too deep and they don't germinate. They also have a smaller amount of carbohydrates in the seed, so they don't last as long. They don't have enough energy sometimes to germinate if they're buried too deep. So to get good seed success, germination success, we suggest increasing that rate. And then if you're planting larger seed, that's maybe 80,000 seeds per pound, we decrease that rate just a little bit. And that's because kind of the opposite. These have a lot of carbohydrate reserves. They do well germinating. They take up more space. A lot of times they're more competitive. And we just want to decrease those a little bit so that we seed the other plants, give them an advantage. Don't give the large plants too much seeds per square foot so that they're going to take over a site. And again, the document that Jane's putting the link towards, it has the seeding rate that we recommend for each of the species, and that's going to get you in this range of seeds per square foot. And I just want to point out something that's important too, why we don't just have a standard recommendation of pounds per acre that we recommend. And it has to do with the seed size. So if you look at, this is a sunflower, and if you compare the size to something like a prairie coneflower or yarrow seed, if you planted each of these at a pound per acre, For the large seed, you'd be seeding it at a rate of 2 seeds per square foot. If you planted a small seed at a pound per acre, you're seeding it at a rate of 18 seeds per square foot. So there can be a real big difference depending on how big your seeds are. So some of the methods we use in revegetation for seeding are either drill seeding, broadcast seeding, you might use a hydro seeding application, or aerial seeding. The drill seeding is really the preferred method if you can find a rangeland drill to use. Some of our conservation districts or Pheasants Forever or some of the weed districts might have drill seeders available for rent if you're looking for any of them. But it's really an optimal way to seed because you can control how deep you're planting your seed. You can get your seed in really good contact with the soil. You can adjust your seed rate, your row width, your planting depth. It just has a lot of different variation, and you can really dial in to your seeding practice. Now, I realize that that's not always available for a lot of people. So a lot of people will use broadcast seeders, or you could use a broadcast seeder and then a harrow behind it. You could use a chain harrow or like a tine harrow, and that just helps you incorporate that seed into the soil a little bit more. And hydro seeding, I really only see that done along highways where they're using it, and I would just caution you to make sure you get the seed in contact with the soil. So maybe apply it first and then apply your hydro mulch. And aerial seeding I really only see with like wildland burned areas, but generally your seeding success decreases as you move this way, with the lowest success being aerial seeding. So what time of year would we want to seed? Most of our grasses and plants that we have in Montana are cool season species, meaning they grow earlier in the spring and germinate earlier in the spring. And a lot of those can either be fall dormant seeded or early spring seeded. And what I mean by that is when you have a fall dormant seeding, you're looking for dates of October 15th or afterwards. So you do not want your plant to germinate. You don't want to risk it germinating and then not being able to overwinter. It might frost kill. So you're putting it in the ground and then you're hoping that it doesn't germinate until spring. And then the early spring seeding is really before May 15th. So you want to get it in the ground in April or early May, and the hope is that you get it in the ground and you can take advantage of that spring moisture that's available and that the plant can put its roots down while there's moisture. Okay, and then if you're seeding a warm season grasses, those really do better if you seed them in the spring, but also an early spring planting. The late summer planting, late summer being August, early September, we really only recommend that if you have a way to irrigate your site and can get your plants up and growing, that they're going to be able to overwinter as a seedling. Okay, so the next step is really to prepare the site and to implement your treatment. So up till now, we've been talking about planning your treatments, and that's because we want to make sure all of the steps are going to work together. So now we're going out and we're actually putting it out on the ground, controlling the weeds, preparing our seed bed, and seeding our site. And since most of you are already experts on controlling the weeds, I'm going to focus on the seed bed preparation. This is really the most important step that you have in your revegetation process, because we want to make sure we have a really good, clean seed bed, and we want to make sure we have good contact with the seed in the soil. So what you do for site prep is really going to be dependent on the site and the species you're using or what equipment you might have available. You want to control the weeds and then create what we call safe sites with seeds. And what I mean by that is we want to have good contact with the soil. We want to make sure that it can get resources that it's going to need to grow. And if you look at this picture, you'll notice that there's a lot of texture to that. That's because we want it to be able to capture water, infiltrate water. We don't want it to just be a smooth, uniform system. We want to give those seedlings a little bit of protection as well. So preparing the site, you can use a lot of different methods. You might prescribe burn it or graze it, and that is mostly to remove some of the vegetation that's already on the site. So you don't want a lot of above ground biomass or litter on the site. You want a way for that seed to get in contact with the soil. And on some sites, you might use a light tilling or harrowing or disking or dragging chains behind your equipment. But if you use some soil disturbance, I would just really caution you, because we are in weedy sites, just to avoid doing excessive soil disturbance, because you're going to release a lot of nutrients that then could promote weeds. So do those really shallowly. And I'll also just mention that there's a lot of really great implements now that you can get for behind four-wheelers. I don't know about the side-by-sides, but look for those in like forestry suppliers or Cabela's or your local dealers, but they're really handy for your revegetation practices. So when you're preparing a site for revegetation, we want to make sure that we have this good balance between having the soil be having it be firm, but not too firm that we're not that we're preventing the seedling from penetrating the soil. So we want it to be loose, kind of uniform. We want the seed to sprout and be able to get into the soil. We want air and water to be able to infiltrate in that soil, but we don't want it fluffy enough or too fluffy that you're going to get too much air and a lot of drying out in that soil. So another rule of thumb we use is, after you've prepared a site, if you walk across it, your footprints should not sink any more than a half of an inch into the soil. And if you think you want to firm up your soil a little bit too, you can roll it to make sure you're removing a lot of the excessive air pockets in there. And also just make sure you absolutely know your chemical history on your site. Okay, and so after you've prepared your site, you've controlled your weeds, now we're getting into the actual seeding. So some of the photos I've showed are in drill seeding, and they're in areas that have been completely disturbed and prepared. And then we're going in with drill seeders, and we get that good soil contact, and we close the row afterwards, and we firm down the soil with our equipment as we go over. But I know a lot of you are working in rangeland settings, and I would say you can use a rangeland drill in a situation where you do have above ground biomass and some above ground growth still on the site. This is where your grazing or your burning is really going to be good beforehand to prepare the site, because if you do have too much vegetation, you're not going to get a lot of good soil to seed contact, or you're going to get a lot of this vegetation bound up in your discs and they're not going to spin or work as well. If you're broadcast seeding onto a site, there's also equipment you can use to just texture the site, like an imprinter. And you can see what it did here in this rangeland setting. After controlling weeds, it's just created a place for your seed to land, also for water to be captured, just adding a little bit more protection for your seedlings. Okay, so now that we've seeded the site, we're getting into the monitoring phase of our project. And some of the things we might want to monitor are the canopy cover or density of both of our weeds, and of our desired species. So what have we seeded, or what was already on site that we want to see continue on site? And there's a lot of different ways you can look at monitoring. You might use hoops or frames, or just visual observations, maybe some photo points. Another really simple way is to walk across your landscape, and say you're gonna walk 100 paces or 50 paces, and every time you put your foot down, you look at the toe of your foot and what plant is there. Is it a seedling? Is it a weed species? And how is that looking for improving on your site? So what does success look like then with a revegetation project? It's really, again, going to depend on your site and what your site is capable of. If you get more precipitation, you'll get more seedlings. And also the quality of your soil is really going to depend on how many seeds you get per square foot. So what we aim for with seeding is to get somewhere between 1 and 5 seedlings established per square foot. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but once they start to mature, we have a lot of bunch grasses, we have a lot of rhizomatous grasses, and you can see in this field trial, I mean, one of these bunch grasses almost covers a square foot. I want to go back to the study I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and this again is data from Jane Mangold. This is a study where they used a combination of revegetation, herbicides, and biocontrol on sites in western Montana, and then they monitored it for 2 years, at year 2, at year 6, and at year 15. So in the herbicide that was used was a glyphosate. It was 1 application. There was very light tillage on the ground also, and then they seeded the 4 different seeding rates on the site. And we're looking here at how much knapweed biomass remained on the site and how much seeded grass biomass was on the site. And the seeded grasses were intermediate wheatgrass and blue bunch wheatgrass. And just a couple things to point out. So they used a herbicide, but it's really short-lived. So you can see after year 1, there's still a lot of knapweed on the site. But it was enough control that we got our grasses established on the site, pretty low biomass. We're only at 26 pounds per acre. But up by year 15, that grass was able to increase to 1,760 pounds per acre. So it's slowly increasing over time. And also the weeds, even though they're still on the site, they saw a decrease of those by about 86% over time by incorporating these 3 techniques, and also the biocontrol that continued to be on the site over time. So just to give you some visual of these sites, this is the non-seeded control after 15 years. This is what it looked like after seeding intermediate wheatgrass after 15 years. So again, we're introducing that desired vegetation on the site. We haven't gotten rid of the weeds completely, but at least you're adding more value and hopefully meeting your land use objective. And this is what it looked like adding the blue bunch wheatgrass to the site. I know we're getting close on time, so I just want to quickly go through some lessons learned. You know, why do seedings fail? First of all, the poor seed quality might be an issue, so you haven't bought your seed in pure live seed. Improper timing, you might have too hot a temperature, it might be too dry already in the season. Also the planting depth, that was really important. Planting your seeds too deep if they're small seeded, or too shallow if they're a large seeded species can be an issue. Also, just having that herbicide carryover can be a problem. And the final step in our revegetation process then is to make sure we're have long-term management on the site. If you're reseeding, we would suggest deferring your grazing for about 2 years to make sure that your seedlings are established, they have good roots down before you're introducing grazing to the site. Also make sure you tailor your management to account for the developing plant community. So if you're grazing the site, maybe use multi-species grazing or low intensity disturbance. And also just continue to keep addressing the weeds that might be reestablishing on the site. But that's all I had for the presentation. If we want to open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. That was great. We have lots of questions. So maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen, it might allow you to see the Q&A box yourself.
Oh, yeah.
I'll also just kind of go through the questions in case other people can't see them. I'll take them from, you know, the top to the bottom. So the ones that have been sitting there the longest to the most
Okay.
recent. So Stacy asked, like for people who are interested in pollinator plantings with an emphasis on forbs, what do you recommend for weed control? I'm guessing like, especially if you're working in an area that has weedy forbs. And she's asking specifically, like, have you had any success with mowing, like the first year mowing, or spot applications of herbicides to control those weedy forbs coming back? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay, so really important is the site prep again before you seed your forbs. So make sure, you know, using glyphosate, non-selective herbicide once or twice before you seed your species. So allow those weeds to germinate and just try to work down the seed bank a little bit. And then if it's not a very big site, you can do some hand pulling or just spot treatments. Again, probably with glyphosate, making sure you don't get it onto your forb species that you're seeding because they're going to be really sensitive to the non-selective herbicides. Let's see, sometimes I'll use mowing in those situations just to make sure your weeds aren't going to seed, or if they're encroaching from the edge, mowing around the edge where you might have weeds coming in and knocking down those weeds. I've also used that technique, but it's going to be ongoing because you're trying to establish a desired forb where you have some weedy forbs. So just know you're going to have some follow-up management.
Okay, the next question is coming in from John. Earlier in your presentation, I think it was when you were talking about whether revegetation is necessary or not, and you mentioned the like 20 to 30% canopy cover rule. Does that rule work if you're working in areas that are infested with annual grasses, or even something like annual forbs like desert alyssum?
Well, you'd want to make sure you have at least 20 to 30% of the desired plant. So as long as you're controlling the weed species, you should see an expansion of your desired species.
And then there's a couple questions here that two people, Alan and Becky, what about bromes? They're interested about bromes. And I don't know if they're, and Becky, maybe you can chime in if you want. I don't know if you're talking about the annual bromes like cheatgrass or Japanese brome, or if you're asking, what about seeding like perennial bromes like smooth brome as a revegetation species?
The latter, Jane.
The like smooth brome?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Any
For
thoughts
me.
on that? Yeah. Thoughts on that, Monica?
Yeah, a lot of people, I mean, we have a lot of smooth brome. The meadow brome, people are planting a little bit more because the thought is it's not as competitive. Sometimes smooth brome can create its own monoculture, so a lot of people aren't as interested in using it in seed mixes anymore, and they're not as nutritious as some of our other plants are. So if you want to seed a brome, I guess I would seed it at a little bit lower proportion of your seed mix, and make sure you can get other species established in there, because we're working a lot too on just how to diversify those stands. Once you get a smooth brome in a site, it's really hard to get other plants to grow.
Yeah, it seems like the NRCS plant materials program has come a long way since, there was a lot of smooth brome planting. It seems like there's a lot more options now in terms of grasses that might even be more beneficial and not have that invasive quality. So, okay, we're
Yeah.
gonna keep going. This is, I think, in reference to talking about seeding rate. If you're broadcast seeding and you're doing that into a weedy site, do you double the base, like the drill seed rate, or would you actually quadruple it? Because you're working in a couple different parameters there to think about.
Yeah, a lot of times we'll quadruple it. But again, you can go back to, what is your seed cost and what is achievable on your site. What species are you using and will they readily establish? So you might be able to do it at like 3 times the normal rate, but you're definitely have to, you decrease the likelihood that something's gonna establish when you use broadcast seeding, and then you also decrease a little bit when you're in a weedy site. So a lot of those, we call them critical area sites, and we'll actually quadruple the seeding rate.
Okay. We're going to keep going.
Okay.
Jim asks, do you have any thoughts about like certified blue tag seed, or just your thoughts on like weed-free seed, kind of along the lines of seed quality?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to know too about the seed quality. Is buying certified seed is really important because the fields have been checked for weeds. We know that the seed is a better quality. You want to make sure you buy a seed that is certified because it'll have it's sort of a guarantee that you know that what the parent plant was and what the characteristics that we selected that plant for are going to be carried through into the seed that you're buying. So that's really important. When you check your seed tag, the seed vendors need to list any noxious weeds that are in the state, but it's only the noxious weeds, so be aware of that because some of the other weed species might not show up on there. And then it's just going to list other weeds and then inert material. I should also mention that we're doing a webinar series through the NRCS, and we have those webinars as we're recording them, posting them on our website. And our next webinar a month from today is going to be on seed quality and seed labels.
Okay, Monica, maybe are you comfortable with sharing your email address in the chat box? And that way, if people have follow-up questions, there are still a few questions we didn't get to. If you could put that in the chat box, and then people will have that, that would be great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for the great questions, for the great presentation. I see many of you are already putting your name. There's Monica's email address, monica.pokorny@usda.gov. It disappeared on me again.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and just share a slide here as we say goodbye, or kind of wrap things up here. Thanks again, Monica. That was fantastic. There were a couple questions about that I want to answer before we say goodbye. Someone asked about where you could access the recordings. The recordings for the presentations are on the same website where you can see the list of webinars and like where you click on the link to register. So I've been putting the recordings next to the presentations. So that's where you can find those. I will also share these resources that Monica shared today, a couple of those websites where you can find a lot of resources that NRCS has. I think that's all. Make sure you put your name in there before you leave if you would like the pesticide applicator credit. For next week, we're going to have Bryce Maxell with the Montana Natural Heritage Program talking about predicted risk models for invasive plants in Montana. So please join us again next week. Please make sure you click on the little continue button when you leave the webinar today so you can give us some feedback on the presentation. And I just want to say thanks again, Monica, for sharing all the great information on revegetation. It's a tough thing to do. So it takes a lot of thought, and thanks for helping us kind of sort through the steps we should take.
Yeah,
So,
thanks a lot for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Monica. It was outstanding.
Thanks, Becky.
Goodbye, everybody.